Welcome everybody to Mom Street USA. My name is Jackie, aka Wishes Mama, and I am joined for this hub episode by my good friend Stevie, aka Starship Stevie. And today we are going to be talking about something that is right in Stevie's wheelhouse, and that is how to read Star Wars. So you're going to hear a lot from Stevie today on all things Star Wars books, all different kinds of literature that you can read, and a little bit about how it ties into the parks too, which is going to be super fun to hear about. So we're excited to bring you guys this totally different topic that we've never talked about on Mom Street before. So super excited for that. Stevie, how are you doing today?
I am great. I am very, very excited because I love Star Wars and I love books and I love Star Wars books. So I'm excited to share that.
It's like we did this for a reason.
What a concept.
All right, so let's talk about just the general world of Star Wars books and what that looks like, because it's probably more extensive than most people realize.
Yes, there's a lot out there and it can be really intimidating to jump in. And I personally have made a lot of content on TikTok about it. I've read a bunch and documented my whole journey through reading a bunch of Star Wars books. So we're going to go over what kinds of Star Wars books there are, how to find them, and how to figure out what you'd want to read. And like Jackie said, figure out what is tie-in material for Galaxy's Edge in Disney World and in Disneyland. But I do want to pause before we get started and say that there's no bad way to be a Star Wars fan. Like, if you love Star Wars movies and you've only seen one of the movies, that's okay. That's perfectly acceptable. You are safe here. And if you want to read everything and, know all of the things, you are also a fan. I totally get how intimidating the whole fandom can kind of seem sometimes, but there are some really lovely pockets of the fandom, especially in the Star Wars book community, that will never, ever make fun of you for asking a question or not knowing something. No matter what you've seen, even if you just like the look of a droid and you've never seen a movie before, you're a Star Wars fan in my book. I say this because ever since I was a kid, I have loved the prequels. I loved Padme and Jar Jar Binks and Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. And I got a lot of flack for loving them as a kid and into my adulthood. And I'm proud of being a fan now. So I feel very protective of other fans. So as long as you're not being mean to other people,
right,
you're welcome in the fandom.
And I think a lot of people experience that too, right? There are some big opinions in any fandom, not just Star Wars. There are very large opinions. So it can be hard, but you also just gotta like what you like and not be afraid to like what you like. And, there's nothing wrong with liking what you like.
Yeah,
full stop.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm going to be honest, one of my favorite things is sharing how much I love Star Wars with other people. And so if you don't know something about Star Wars, I love answering it because I want to bring you into the fold, I want you to enjoy it with me too.
Yes.
So I think that's part of why I love talking about this so much.
So fun. I love it.
So how do you start reading Star Wars books? And so the short, annoying answer is that there's no wrong place to start. Every single Star Wars book is written that you can just pick that one up and understand what's going on. It's not like there's a series and you have to start way back at book one. You're good if you just want to pick something up and go ahead. You will still enjoy yourself. Will you get more out of it if you've seen some of the movies or read other things in the era first? Sure, but you can absolutely go in blind and have a great time. But for context, Star Wars books come in all kinds of shapes and colors and categories. So there's young adult books, middle grade books, children's books, comics, and even manga. There's so many things to read out there.
So many things.
So many things. And so to credential myself, between all of those categories, I have read 176 Star Wars titles.
I love that you know the specific number.
So I know the number because I track everything that I read.
Yes.
And I tag it with Star Wars. So that way I can go back for stuff like this. If somebody asks me for recommendations, I can be like, well, this is what you might like. And I like to cater my recommendations based on what somebody else is interested in, because I want you to read something that you might enjoy. And so that's definitely what my recommendations are based around.
Yeah, I love that you know the exact number. That's so lovely and wonderful. And there's so many more than that too, which is just crazy.
There's still so much I have not read. I don't think that I've even, I guess I've maybe read 50% if I were making a rough guess.
Yeah.
But I think that I'm maybe only at a third. if I'm really counting truly everything.
Yeah.
So there's a lot out there because Disney started publishing Star Wars books right after A New Hope was released.
Okay.
So the books have been here since 1977, I believe, is when A New Hope was released. I can't remember if it was 77 or 79, but in the 70s,
Crazy.
they started releasing books.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So there is, in terms of context for Star Wars books, when Disney acquired Star Wars, they reset the content of the books. And so what that means is that everything that was published before Disney acquired Lucasfilm is no longer considered canon. I will explain why this is important, but if you've not ever heard the word canon before, it's spelled C-A-N-O-N. It's not spelled like the pirate ship weapon. But
Good to know.
yes, if something is canon, it means that it actually happened in the universe. And if something is not canon, it means that it's not considered true or part of the universe anymore. So this means that if a book was published before 2014, before Lucasfilm and Disney started releasing books together, Lucasfilm no longer considers those titles as something that actually took place within the Star Wars universe anymore.
That is fascinating to me.
Right?
That they literally just hit the reset button. Mm-hmm. What? What?
It means that it means a couple things. It means that there's an easier entry point into picking up the books.
True.
But if you're looking at something that isn't labeled, that was published before that, it's kind of hard to figure out what's what. But I'm going to explain and break all of that down.
Yeah, because I would see a published date in the 2000s, even early 2000s, and go, oh, this is fairly recent. Like, it probably will make sense with movies and series and things. But, like, nope.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah. So if it was published before, if it was published during or after 2014, it is generally considered a canon Star Wars book. Obviously, there are things like recipe books and other like picture books and things, and those aren't like canon necessarily, but are still tied in with the content that's being released right now. And if it was published before 2014, it's now what Lucasfilm calls and labels a Legends book, and it's not canon anymore. So I'm going to give you an example of what a Legends content looks like using a small Legends spoiler, and then I'll explain why all of this matters when you're trying to figure out what to read. So in the Legends books, Luke Skywalker eventually gets married.
Oh.
But because it happened in the Legends books, it's no longer considered to be true to the universe. Okay. So when you see Luke Skywalker in the sequel trilogy, that plot line that he got married never actually happened to that character, and that history was erased, essentially.
That is so crazy. And a little confusing. Because, like how well known is it that is no longer canon? You know what I mean? Are there people wandering around that that think that Luke Skywalker got married, but he actually it got reset and he didn't?
The people that are really attached to those books are absolutely aware, and I think are a little upset that it's been erased. And I totally understand why.
So tell us why does this matter? Like the whole Legends canon, not canon, people mad about not being canon anymore. What does this have to do with the future of us reading Star Wars?
So if part of why you want to read Star Wars books is to enrich your enjoyment of the movies or the time that you spend in the parks, it's often easiest to do that with the canon books. Just because it ties in, it's designed to have moments that you can look for that can enrich your understanding of the Star Wars universe. And especially if you're new to reading Star Wars books, my opinion is that it's more fun to read about characters that are canonically tied to what you can go back and watch. And you can look for those Easter eggs, and it makes the movies more fun, in my opinion. I say that loving both the Legends and the canon books. I want to put that out there. I do love them both.
So don't come for Stevie. Don't come for her.
But being that this is the conversation we're having and we're talking about the parks, why mention Legends at all if it's not canon? And the answer is that because there's already so many Star Wars books, when you go looking for something to read, and if you don't already have a title in your mind that you want to pick up, it can be kind of hard and overwhelming because there's just so much to look at. And if you do a simple Google, you're going to get all kinds of things. And it can just be a little overwhelming. I find that it's most fun to treat the Legends books as myths to the Star Wars universe. Like it's a tall tale that gets shared between characters like in generations, like in the Star Wars universe.
Yeah.
And that's my preferred way of looking at those stories because I really love all of those plot lines and the books that I have read that are Legends and all of the books that I still want to read that are Legends. They're still good and fun, but it's just a way to categorize things in your brain.
Yeah. So what is the best way, if you're Googling titles, like you said, what is the best way to figure out where we're reading? Are we reading canon? Are we reading Legends? Where are we at? What are we doing?
Yes. So most of the Legends books that were republished after 2014 have a really handy gold banner. And if you are watching along with the podcast, you'll be able to see what I'm holding up. But I will describe it for you. In the re-released books, there's a gold banner along the cover and on the spine of the book that says Essential Legends Collections. And they've been going through and republishing all of the old content. So it's way easier to see what's what and kind of see how they classify these books now. Yeah. If it was published before 2014, you're just looking at a standard book and the cover might look a little dated, and that's probably your best way to go. But you can check the publication date inside. Yeah. And there will be, once you have read a couple books, there will be other clues where it makes it a lot easier to guess. A lot of these Star Wars books have timelines in the beginning of the book, and it gives you other titles that you can read, and you'll start to see all of these other titles. And if there's one that you recognize that's a Legends title and you see it in here, that will give you a clue that the book that you're looking at is also a Legends book.
That makes sense.
You can also Google it, and there are plenty of resources on the internet that'll say, yes, this is canon, no, this isn't canon. And that's really helpful too.
Are there any specific resources that you like for looking up that type of thing?
Wikipedia is my favorite website. It does such a great job of classifying everything. There are lists of, like, if you can Google a character and it will give you appearances and everywhere that character has appeared. If you just like a planet and you think a planet is really cool. So for example, Batuu is the planet that's in Galaxy's Edge in Disneyland and Disney World. You can search Batuu on Wikipedia and there is a section that'll say, here are all of the places in Star Wars media where Batuu is mentioned. And I think that's really cool if you want to just go planet by planet or character by character to find whatever it is that you're looking for.
Yeah, so if you're wondering how in the world to spell that, Wookie, 2 E's.
Yes, 2 E's.
2 E's, and then Pedia.
Yes.
So
if you type in an approximation, Google will get you there.
Yes. But then searching things within that is going to get you to those pages that Stevie was just talking about.
But now that we've established these two categories, how do you pick what to read first? For reference, if you're just looking at the canon adult novels, there's still over 100 to choose from, just so you have kind of an idea of how much is out there. So I totally understand that it can be so overwhelming to get started. And so my recommendation is to pick a category. Pick your favorite movie era, your favorite character, and go from there. And I'm going to go over some of these categories and some of my recommendations within each category. So if you just want a title and that's all you need to go running off to your library or the bookstore, I got you covered.
Perfect. Yes. Because sometimes it can be, it's like the overwhelm of like, there is so much to choose from. And even if you're someone that's like, oh, I like the newest movie or the newest series, there's still going to be a big list of things that you can read that are related to that. So like this is helpful to at least give us a starting point, and then from there you'll at least have your in, and you can go and be free to pick whatever you choose to read after that.
Exactly.
Perfect.
So let's get into the recommendations.
Okay.
I'm going to start with the original trilogy because it started it all and it also matches the sweater that I'm wearing if you're
Love.
watching us on video. But if you love the original trilogy and that's your favorite of the 3 movie trilogies, I would recommend books that follow the original characters. So my 2 favorites on this list are Princess and the Scoundrel by Beth Revis. This book follows Han and Leia on their honeymoon. It literally picks up right at the end of Return of the Jedi. It is so sweet. I love it so much. And they take their honeymoon on the Halcyon Star Cruiser that you used to be able to visit in Orlando, Florida. And I think that that is a really cute and fun tie-in to
I had
be
always
able to read about
heard that that was the case, but I never knew where that came from. So now I know.
Yes, you can look it up online. There is a little nod to that moment on that it was actually in the Star Cruiser. You can probably find photos. They carved their initials into part of the ship.
Oh, I love
And I
that.
think that that's really precious.
Oh, it's so sad that that's gone.
Yeah, I never got to stay there and I'm still very sad about it. I have to live vicariously through videos on the internet. My second recommendation is the Aftermath trilogy by Chuck Wendig, and this also picks up a little further after Princess and the Scoundrel, after Return of the Jedi, and it basically answers the question, what happens in the Star Wars universe after they destroy the second Death Star? This follows a bunch of new characters that interact with characters that you're already familiar with in the original trilogy. I am so obsessed with this trilogy. It is so much fun. The new characters are it's intimidating at first when you're going in and you're meeting new characters and there's not that sense of familiarity, but once it kicks in, it just goes, and there's so much fun lore and details in the Aftermath books that really just make me love the original trilogy that much more.
Yeah, I love stories that do that, right? Like they tie in and they reference this, but at the same time, you get all this new stuff too. So it's like a nice little bridge between.
If you love the prequel trilogy, my suggestions start with Brotherhood by Mike Chen. This follows Obi-Wan and Anakin, and it just feels like a love letter to the prequels and those 2 characters. I love it so much. And then my other recommendation for the prequels is also a Master Padawan story. It's actually called Master and Apprentice, and it's by Claudia Gray. This follows Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, and this book is my absolute favorite Star Wars book ever. There is a quote from Obi-Wan in there that I think about all the time. I love it so much. It is just like the thesis of why I love Star Wars so much, and I love talking about it.
Well, now I feel like in order to maintain my best friend status, I have to read that book.
It is so much fun if you love The Phantom Menace specifically, because it's got Qui-Gon, and I was so sad that like we only get Qui-Gon for one movie, and so and I've got somebody in the comments right now, thank you Chaco, that is quoting my favorite line from the book, I turn towards the light because it is the light. There's so many great little Jedi isms in that book, and it is a love letter to The Phantom Menace, and I love it so much.
That's so fun.
If you love the sequel trilogy, I have 2 suggestions. The first one being Resistance Reborn by Rebecca Roanhorse. And this book follows all of the characters in the sequels, and it happens right before The Rise of Skywalker. And The Rise of Skywalker is a movie I enjoy, but it's not my favorite Star Wars movie. And this book makes me appreciate that movie a lot more. And so I am very attached to this book because of the way that it helps me reframe some of the scenes that happen in episode 9.
Yeah, that's helpful to know because I feel like, again, we talked about earlier, there are a lot of big opinions in the Star Wars fandom about the original trilogy, the prequel trilogy, the new things that are coming out. So anytime you can give yourself a little bit more context for appreciation, I think is a good thing.
Yes. And the second recommendation I have does the same kind of thing. It gives more context to the story, and it's called Shadow of the Sith by Adam Christopher. And this book follows Luke and Lando before the events of The Force Awakens, and it lays the groundwork for a lot of the events that happen throughout the sequel trilogy. I was listening to this book on audiobook, and I will talk about audiobooks for Star Wars in a minute, but I was listening to the audiobook while I was walking my dog, and there is a wonderful scene in the middle of the book with Luke that I don't want to spoil for anybody, but I was crying while walking my dog.
Oh no!
I'm sure that my neighbors were very confused, but I love that book so much. Any book that makes me cry in public is just one that I have to like recommend to other people.
Right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with crying in public. There's nothing wrong with a book making you feel the feels. You know, just
All of it.
fair warning. Now you know. Okay, so earlier you mentioned that we were going to hear some tie-in to the parks. So what can you tell us about if we want to read something that maybe will give us more context before we're visiting Galaxy's Edge on either coast? What should we look for?
So, as I mentioned before in the episode, the planet that you're visiting when you go to Galaxy's Edge is called Batuu, and there are several books that take place on Batuu. The first one is A Crash of Fate by Zoraida Cordova, and so this follows two kids that grow up on Batuu. You don't need to know anything about Star Wars. They're all new characters, and it is... Not many Star Wars books to me are like cozy reads, but there's an element of this book that just like makes me want to curl up with it on a rainy day under like a pile of blankets. That is the vibe for this book for me.
I love that. And what age level is that book? Like, what would be a good age to read that one? Because I feel like a lot of us, like, we want to give our kids context too, right?
Yes. So YA kind of spans this 12 to 18 age range. I would definitely say it's probably like 14 to 18 because it's a love story. And so like if your kids don't like love stories, it's not like super romancy, but the two kids that grow up together are romantically interested in one another. So
Gotcha. That's
the
good to know.
there. Yes.
Perfect. Okay. What else should we look for if we're going to be visiting Disney World, Disneyland?
The next book that I want to recommend is Galaxy's Edge Black Spire by Delilah S. Dawson. And this book follows a character named Vi Moradi who lands on Batuu hoping to establish a resistant outpost. And I have to stop here and gush about how much I love Vi Moradi. So she is a character that was developed specifically for the Disney parks. So if you are, I meant to bring a photo so that way we could show everybody, but if you're listening to this, she has a really recognizable bright orange jacket and she has blue stripes in her hair. And she is canonically Leia Organa's best spy. She is so much fun to talk to in the parks. I love seeing her. And it's because she's always doing spy stuff. I think why I had the easiest time talking to her, and that's not just because I know who she is from reading the books and like knowing about Galaxy's Edge, is that being easy to talk to is like part of who her character is, like at its core, because she was sent to the planet to build a base for the resistance. And so that means she's got to be good at talking to people. She's got to be good at making friends and getting in and out of trouble and making good trouble. And so she's just so much fun to like figure out what she's doing and like help her avoid stormtroopers in the parks. She's just a joy. She's so easy to just like hang out with and go on an adventure, and it makes Galaxy's Edge feel so much more immersive.
Yeah,
being around whatever she's getting into.
Well, and that's one of the huge differences about that space in the parks, right? Is like it is meant to be this completely immersive world, you know. And I've talked about previously when we talked about like character autographs. Characters don't sign autographs on Batuu because they're not famous characters on that in that world, right? That the Disney people and Imagineers have created for us to experience. So it's just part of the immersivity. Is that a word? It's going to be a word. And I'm just going to pretend that it is. You know, that's part of it. And she brings another aspect to that, which is so fun, especially if you're like aware of her and know at least just a little bit about her backstory.
Absolutely. I will add that Vi is also featured in a Star Wars book called Phasma, which is also by Delilah S. Dawson. Phasma is about Captain Phasma, who is one of the antagonists in the sequels. And Vi is a main character in that book. It's mostly told from her perspective. And this book is technically a prequel to Galaxy's Edge Black Spire, but you don't have to read it beforehand if you don't want to. I think that it enhances your understanding of the book, but again, not required reading necessarily.
And if you're going into, let's say you're going into this, you have zero Star Wars experience, but you want to read enough to give you Galaxy's Edge. Would those two, do you feel like, be enough to give you a good basis of what Star Wars is, Galaxy's Edge is, Batu, all of that?
Definitely. There is a lot of great world building that happens in those books that talks about the geographic sites that you can see when you're on Batu and walking around the planet, things that have cultural significance to the area, explanations for some of the characters that own different shops in Galaxy's Edge. And that is part of why I love it so much, because then I've got an explanation for who Savi is in Savi's workshop. Like, all of those kinds of things make everything way more fun. Like the droids that work in the restaurants. Like, there's just so much cool stuff that they very intentionally built into these books to be released in tandem with Galaxy's Edge when it opened.
Right. And like, you guys know Disney, all of you that are listening, like, you're listening for a reason. So like, everything has a story in that space. It's a little trickier to find because we're so used to them laying it out in movies for us. And that's one of the things about Galaxy's Edge, that it is to an extent, right? If you go to Galaxy's Edge and you've just seen a Star Wars movie, you're going to be fine, right? Like, it's meant to cater to that. But if you want to know the details about, like you were talking about, the people who own the shops and the restaurants and things like that, this is where you want to go for that.
Yeah, there's absolutely a story there, and there is absolutely payoff if you decide to go down the rabbit hole of all of the stories in there. It's so cool. I love it so much.
Yes, I'm like ready to pick up those two books and read them to my oldest, because he is just kind of starting to get into Star Wars, and I kind of got to test the water with him. So if I can at least relay information to him from the books, then we'll start there.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
see, because like, he's 8, he's not quite ready for some of this yet. Reading wise, he is, like, level wise, but content wise, we're not quite there yet, and that's okay. I don't need to push him to be there when he's not ready for that. But if I read them and then relay the information to him, we'll be good to go.
Yeah. And I have recommendations for that age range. I know it can be a tricky age range, but we will get to that in a minute.
Yes. Okay. So we talked about favorite movies and things like that kind of guiding your reading. What if we just want to pick a character? Where are we going for that?
Are in luck. So I love Leia, if that wasn't abundantly clear by
The
somebody
giant
that's on
Leia
my
picture
shirt.
on your shirt.
There are lots of books where Leia is in the book, and there are also lots of books where she's the featured main character and you're following her point of view. One of my favorite books, all of my favorite Star Wars books, like aside from Master and Apprentice, like the Leia books are all up there because Claudia Gray writes a lot of them, and actually Claudia Gray also writes Master and Apprentice. She does an incredible job capturing Leia's voice, and I just feel like I'm hearing Carrie Fisher when I read the books about Leia, and so like that just makes the experience even better. But if I had to pick one Leia book, I'm going to recommend Bloodline by Claudia Gray. In this book, Leia is in her 40s. It's after Return of the Jedi, and we're kind of watching the fallout of what happens to the government when they're trying to rebuild after the fall of the Empire. And it really leads up to kind of understand how the First Order gets its footing before we see the sequels. And it does just such a wonderful job of laying that groundwork. It's surprisingly a really political book as much as it is a fantasy, Star Wars-y kind of book.
Yeah, that one sounds interesting to me because I feel like in the movies, we miss so much of what Leia was doing, right?
Yes.
Like, she, we watch the end of Return of the Jedi, and then she's which a lot of the characters were also just kind of gone for a while, but like, she specifically, she just like pops back up, and we're like, wait a minute, how did this happen?
And all
how
of a
did we
sudden
get
she's
here?
General Leia.
Yes, like General Leia. Like, hold on, how did we get here?
Yes. And so if you want to see her transition from princess and junior senator, during her time as princess to when she becomes General Leia, this covers all of that, and it is so cool because she's really reckoning emotionally with the events of Return of the Jedi. I have chills talking about it. It's fine. I love Leia so much, if you couldn't tell.
You are not alone. Anna and Christina, both in our live chat here as we're recording, are talking about, yes, all of the Leia is their favorite. So
Obi-Wan is one of my other favorite characters, and Obi-Wan also has several books about him. I mentioned one earlier, Master and Apprentice, and Brotherhood also features Obi-Wan, but for an exclusively Obi-Wan POV book, you're going to want Padawan by Kirsten White. And this takes place when Obi-Wan is a Padawan, and it is so much fun. It's another book that I feel like falls in the cozy Star Wars,
Yeah.
if that exists. And
it does now. We just
it does
created
now.
it.
It's another YA book, and so the stakes are kind of lowered appropriately because it's meant for young adults and that 12 to 18 age range, and that's around the age that Obi-Wan is, I think. I could be wrong, but he's a Padawan, and so he is a teenager. He's younger, and he's dealing with everything that comes along with being somebody that's growing up in the Jedi Temple. So it's a lot of fun.
Okay, so for those of us who don't know Star Wars, explain briefly what a Padawan is.
A Padawan is somebody that's learning how to be a Jedi.
Perfect.
If you first get to the Jedi Temple as a kid, you are a youngling. And as you age through the Jedi Temple, you eventually become a Padawan learner, and you are apprenticed to a Jedi Knight or a Master. And then you kind of ascend through the ranks. And so after Padawan, you graduate to knighthood. And then if you continue doing specific training and trials, you can become a Jedi Master. And some of the Masters also sit on the Jedi Council, which we see in the prequels. So if you remember Jedi sitting in chairs in a circle in a room, and some of them are holographs, that is the Jedi Council.
That's helpful because I don't think I've watched the prequels in decades. But when you said that, I was like, oh, that sounds vaguely familiar.
Yes. And so the Jedi Council makes lots of decisions about what the Jedi Order is going to do, how they respond to things. They're also the ones that interface with the Senate. They interface with Emperor Palpatine. We don't speak his name. No, I'm just kidding. But they're the ones doing all of that.
Okay, fair. Okay, so that gives a few little character highlights. Obviously, there are more. So, like we talked about, this is a very condensed version of all of the books that we could possibly mention. We do not want to mention all 300 plus books. So, if you're looking for a specific character, again, we talked about going to that Wikipedia website, type in that character name. It'll give you a list of all the different places you can find them, and that'll kind of give you an idea to start with. Or if you're like, I don't know where to start still, I'm still very overwhelmed, you can send us a message, or you can send Stevie a message, and we will help you figure out where to start.
Absolutely. And I will say, if you like the movies, but you want to intentionally kind of start over and start with something new and meet a lot of characters that are brand new to you, there's also an option there. A couple years ago, Star Wars started releasing books in a whole new time frame in the timeline, and those books happened during the High Republic, and that is what that era is called. And so this era is set centuries before the Phantom Menace. So a couple hundred years before we meet Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, that's when these books take place. And I am so obsessed with all of them. When you go in and you know that there are all of these new characters and it's like a multi-POV book and you're getting to meet all of these people, it can also seem kind of overwhelming. But the writers that write the High Republic books, they all got together in a group and had lots of planning meetings. And so all of those books feel interconnected. Yes. And they're so well engineered. And you were so attached to all of those characters immediately. And I can't help but mention those books because they are so much fun. And I will break down all of that in a second.
Yeah, I feel like that makes such a huge difference, right? Especially when you're going into familiar territory, but new characters. You know, how do you navigate that as a writer? How do you navigate that as a reader or a listener if you're doing, audiobooks? And like Stevie said, we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But having that consistency and the way that they all kind of link together is super helpful.
Yes, absolutely. And they did such a good job at it too, because like you can definitely like go in with that being your goal, but then to pull
Right.
it off is like a whole
Yeah.
other thing. And they absolutely
Actually
pulled
do
it
what they
off.
wanted to do.
Yes,
Right,
yes.
for sure.
So I'm going to break down how to get into the High Republic because I definitely think that it's worthwhile. There are 3 phases that these books were released in, and they are treated just like the movie trilogies that you're already familiar with. So if you think about, well, let me back up. The first chunk of books that were released in what Lucasfilm calls Phase 1 of the High Republic. And this sets up the High Republic era. It helps you understand what the Jedi Order was like a couple hundred years before the prequel trilogy. And then they released another set of books and called those books Phase 2. And these books take place before the events of Phase 1. And so if you think about the original trilogy, yes, hang with me. I know this is confusing, but think about the original trilogy. And the original trilogy was released in the 70s.
Right.
And then the prequel trilogy happens beforehand,
Right.
but it was released way later.
Yeah.
So it's, you still understand the story, and when
Yeah.
you're watching the original trilogy, you're having a great time. And when you watch the prequel trilogy, now you've got all of this emotional context for what is happening in the original trilogy.
Yeah, I just think
And-
it's silly that they named them 1 and 2. Like, come up with a different name, people. Because,
I
like,
understand.
if I'm looking at those and I go, oh, Phase 1, I'll read that first. Which, like, is still fine. Like you said, obviously, you can read them in either order. But, like, y'all, what are we doing?
Well, but like if you read Phase 1 first and then you go back and you read Phase 2, you've got all of that like emotional context.
Right.
And this is another, like we were talking about Star Wars opinions. Lots of people have opinions on the right way to watch Star Wars for the first time. Do you start with Episode 4 or do you start with Episode 1? And I don't think there's a wrong answer, but I do
Right.
think that there's more emotional impact if you start with 4, you watch 4, 5, 6, and then you go the way that the movies were chronologically released. So 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. And I mean, I would then watch Rogue One and then 4, 5, 6 again, and then go into the sequels, just because
totally
you're
fair.
watching it with new eyes, you
Right.
know?
Yes.
Once you know Obi-Wan and who he was in the prequels, you
Right.
want to watch him again in A New Hope.
Yeah.
But that's the way I see it, and I definitely
Yeah.
think that that's the most fun way to read the High Republic is
Yeah.
to do Phase 1 and then read Phase 2, and then they're publishing it right now when we're recording this podcast is Phase 3, which happens after the events of Phase 1. So just like I know. So just like this
Can't.
so just like the sequel trilogy was released third after the original
Right.
and the prequels, the events of the sequel trilogy take place last. And so
I guess
it's the
they're
same kind of
consistent
setup.
at least.
Yes, they're very consistent.
I'm still bothered, but okay, I'll take the consistency.
You can jump around, you can do it chronologically, just like you can start with The Phantom Menace. But
Right.
I think that there's a more emotional payoff if you go the way that Lucasfilm has released things chronologically, because that's the way that
Right.
it was designed. So
Right. But
I
here's the thing,
understand
where
that
is
it's
my
confusing.
guide? Where is my guide? Other than Stevie, my best friend. Where is my guide?
So I will link this
For-
in the Pocket Fam Discord, but if you just
Perfect.
Google Star Wars, the High Republic reading order, the Star Wars website has it listed, and it has a little intro in the beginning to remind you that, like, hey, you can start in Phase 1, or you can start in Phase 2, and it reminds
Amazing.
you, one is the way that things were published, and then one is the way that things chronologically happen in universe. So you got lots of options.
Perfect. And if you need the
generally-
link to that Discord, it is in all of our social media bios for Mom Street, so find it there.
So the first book in Phase 1 does a really great job of setting up the High Republic. You don't have to read everything in the High Republic. Each phase usually has 2 to 3 adult books, 2 to 3 young adult books. Same thing with middle grade and comics. You don't have to read everything. You can kind of jump around. But I do think that that very first book that they published does a wonderful job of setting up all of the phases, because it gives you a feel for what the universe is like then. And that book is called Light of the Jedi by Charles Soule. reading that book will help you jump into anything else that you want to do. You don't necessarily have to go and read everything, but I do think that you'd be doing yourself a disservice if you didn't at least just start with that one in particular.
Let's continue with the High Republic.
Well,
or are we done with the High Republic?
We're done with the High Republic.
Perfect.
I do want to jump to audiobooks. I go through spurts when, as much as I love reading, I will have a hard time just sitting still and focusing.
Yeah.
And I find audiobooks are a great way to kind of help my brain keep going, and I get to feel like I'm experiencing a story. And I will listen to audiobooks while I clean, while I do laundry, while I walk the dog. And I have an app that connects to my library, so I can check out audiobooks all the time whenever I want. And I highly recommend Libby if you haven't checked it out yet. It's very easy to connect your library card to that app. But Star Wars audiobooks are on another level. If you've listened to audiobooks before, Star Wars audiobooks are a different breed. And I can explain. They often include sound effects and music. And so it feels very cinematic.
Yeah.
It just feels like you're watching something in your brain. And especially like if you need to like zone out, like if you lay down and close your eyes with your earbuds in, it's so easy to picture.
Yeah.
It's so much fun. And I love that that's something that they include in the audiobooks. I will add that there is one audiobook narrator in particular that does an incredible Han Solo impression. And it took me a while to figure out that they didn't just get Harrison Ford to do Han's lines in the book.
Oh my gosh. That's impressive.
Mark Thompson is right. Mark Thompson is the narrator that I'm referring to. He has narrated a couple of the audiobooks that I've already mentioned, including the Aftermath trilogy by Chuck Wendig and Resistance Reborn by Rebecca Roanhorse. He also narrates a Legends book. I'm throwing it back to when I explained what Legends books are. He narrates a Legends trilogy that I really love that centers around Grand Admiral Thrawn, and that the first book in that trilogy is Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn. Star Wars also releases audio dramas, which is a step above an audiobook. And that means that instead of one narrator, an audio drama is a full cast that essentially does a script reading. And it's even more dynamic than Star Wars audiobooks already are.
I didn't even know that was a thing.
So cool. It is so cool to get a full cast listening to you do something. It is wonderful. And so like, if you start with that, it's not that I don't want you to start with something that is absolutely the best, but after that, when you're not getting a full cast, everything is like a letdown, because like you're not getting like this movie in your brain. So,
right. That's good to keep in mind.
There are audio dramas in the High Republic, but there are also some in the more current canon. I really love Dooku Jedi Lost by Cavan Scott. And this follows Count Dooku and Asajj Ventress. So if you really loved the Clone Wars TV show, or if you loved Count Dooku in the prequels, I really recommend this. It gives you really good insight into who Count Dooku is and why he is the way he is.
Don't even know that name, so I need that one.
He is the one in Attack of the Clones that fights Yoda, and he fights Obi-Wan. He's the one that, like, when they're in at the climax point in Attack of the Clones, when they're all attached to poles, when Padme, Anakin, and Obi-Wan are like fighting off beasts, and there's like a big stadium around them, Count Dooku is the one that like puts them out there, and he's just like, you could have come to the dark side with me, but because you're not, I'm sentencing you to this very public, like Greek style execution. And of course they fight their way out of it, and that's when Padme gets her iconic like white outfit that gets torn.
I recognized his face like a little because I googled him as you were talking. But I do not remember any of that. Yeah, I haven't, like I said, I haven't watched the prequels in a really long time, so that's okay.
That scene is like crucial to like who little me is, because in that scene Padme is like handcuffed to this pole, but she gets a bobby pin out of her hair and uses that to pick the lock on her handcuffs, and that just like defined me as a child. Like I loved her in the Phantom Menace,
locks with,
but then I just
bobby
like
pins?
I wanted to learn because of this.
Hey, that's an important life skill that Padme's teaching all the girls.
You never know what you could use a bobby pin in your hair
It's so
for.
true.
You know?
It's so true. Oh
Anyways,
my
the
gosh.
other audio
Anyway.
drama that I really love is called Dr. Aphra by Sarah Kuhn. Dr. Aphra is a character that first appeared in the Star Wars comics, and then she got her own audio drama. She's wildly unpredictable as a character, and I'm not exaggerating. She is a chaotic archaeologist slash smuggler, and the Star Wars website describes her as morally bankrupt. And I agree.
Oh, okay. I mean, at least that gives you an image of her. Okay.
It's a very clear picture, and I point that out because you definitely need to know that before you go into this book. It will set your expectations that she is the most morally gray of all morally gray characters, but she's somehow still endearing and charming and funny, even though she's absolutely morally bankrupt. But that book is so much fun because she's just a very silly goose. Silly goose to the extreme.
You guys didn't think you were going to hear that phrase on this episode. Always keeping you on your toes.
Because I just mentioned the comics and Dr. Aphra, I do want to briefly go over Star Wars comics. There are so many, and I don't know that I have enough time to do a breakdown of how to get into that. The short answer for how to get into Star Wars comics looks a lot like my advice for Star Wars books, which is start with characters or eras that you already love, and when in doubt, start with something that says Volume 1 or Issue 1.
That's totally valid.
And this is something that is an issue with all comics and not just Star Wars comics, that it's really hard to figure out where to jump in. And it's one of those things where it's you kind of just got to dive in and then learn how to tread water, which is not a great answer. But once you do it, it's very easy to start treading water once you jump in. But I do have a couple recommendations. All of the Darth Vader comics are excellent. There are a couple different series that follow Vader during different periods of his life. And you'd think that because we're following a villain, that it wouldn't be fun or interesting. But because of what you might already know about Anakin and Darth Vader, there's so much to explore there that I really enjoy. So there was a run in 2015, and the first book, and I will add, a lot of times we'll use graphic novels and comics interchangeably as a term. But right now, when I'm referring to comics, I really mean a graphic novel, which is a bind up of 1 to 5 or sometimes 1 to 20 single issue comics all in one book. And it occurred to me that I did not bring an example of that in my props over here. I apologize for anybody watching. But the first book in that 2015 run is called Vader by Kieran Gillen. I was able to get these digitally online through my library, and I was able to read it as an ebook. Some libraries have physical copies of comic books too. They're usually in a different section of the library, and you might have to ask and figure out where they keep them. But most libraries that I've been to have some kind of selection, even if it's small. And there's also a 2020 run, and the first book in that series is called Dark Heart of the Sith by Greg Pak. I love the series in particular because, as I mentioned before, I love Padme and I love her handmaidens that we get to meet in The Phantom Menace. And the 2020 Darth Vader comic book run helps answer the question, what happened to Padme's handmaidens after episode 3? Where did they go? What happened? What did they do? And it is a really interesting character study. And it's just, there's so much to read.
As you have found out throughout the length of this episode, because we're not done yet.
No. I also really love the main Star Wars comic series that started in 2015, and that follows Leia, Luke, and Han. And that volume starts with a book called Skywalker Strikes by Jason Aaron.
So I have to ask with that, because so much of us we're used to just what we saw in the movies. Mm-hmm. So do you find that most of those comics, for example, the one that you just mentioned, the main Star Wars ones, are they happening in between movies? Are they when do a lot of those stories take place? I'm just curious.
That is a great question. And the answer is most of the time it's happening between movies. Yeah. Anytime where we're not seeing a character on screen is when there could be a comic book that involves that character. That main series, Skywalker Strikes, happens throughout the original trilogy. And it's really fun because in those books, you're getting to see Luke kind of deal with what is happening during the original trilogy. Like, he has just lost Ben. He doesn't really know what to do with himself about how to be a Jedi and where to go, who to learn from. Is he going to have to teach himself? Like, what is the Force? How do you use the Force? And other people in the galaxy starting to learn or hear rumors about, oh, there's somebody that can use the Force. The Jedi, I thought all of the Jedi were dead. And so there are a lot of tiny little questions that the comic books really expand and explore. And I think that's part of what makes the comic books so fun. They also explain a lot of fun, like, throwaway lines. Like, in the original trilogy, in the movies, at one point Leia calls Han a stuck-up, half-witted, scruffy-looking nerf herder. And nerf herder sounds like a fun, like, made-up Star Wars word because it inherently is. But nerfs are an animal in the Star Wars universe that you can evidently herd. And that is all that we really know when we watch that scene in the movie. That I don't know what it means, but Leia's certainly using it as an insult or trying to.
Right.
And in the comics, they have nerfs on a ship. And it just, Luke and Han are running around trying to accomplish something while the nerfs are there. And it kind of means that he is canonically a nerf herder. Like, and it just is really funny to me personally. That they canonized Han being a nerf herder and that Leia's referring to that and she can't think of anything else.
And that they made it a massive plot point in one of the comic books.
Yes.
Love that. Amazing.
The comics just do such a great job of exploring all kinds of things, and they do that for the Disney parks as well. There are comics specific to Galaxy's Edge and to Batuu, and so I do want to mention a couple of those. Galaxy's Edge is the title of one of the books, and it's by Ethan Sachs, and it shows a bunch of different fan favorite characters when they're on Batuu for one reason or another. So, like, Han and Chewie they have a job and they're on Batuu. And so you're getting to see them interact with all of these different characters. And it just shows little snapshots of what happened to those characters when they were on Batuu. And it makes the world feel so lived in that to me, again, you're getting to learn about all of the different shop owners and you're, because it's a comic book, getting to see that as well. And so there's something that really makes it come alive that I think, especially if you're not sure whether or not your kids are ready for some of the other books, even just flipping through some of the pages in the comics and be like, oh, you know Han Solo already. Look, he's walking around in the place that we're about to be in when we go to the parks. And I think that is just so cool.
Yeah, I feel like anytime I can relate that, which is why I'm like, I need to get these. Like, it's been on my list for a while and I need to just follow through and do it. Because I know that my oldest, I mean, you know how much he's into just graphic novels and comics in general right now. Like, that is all he wants to read, which, like, I don't blame him. That's all I would want to read at his age too. but getting him some of this, then I can't wait to then take him, because we're going in a few months, and him to be like, oh, I read about that. Because he will 100% make those connections.
Yeah, absolutely. I have another honorary mention for Star Wars: The Halcyon Legacy, which is also by Ethan Sachs. This comic explores different events that happened on the Halcyon Star Cruiser that sadly no longer exists in Walt Disney World, Florida. But the story is really cute, and it features characters that you would have interacted with on the ship. I, again, never stayed on the Star Cruiser, but I've seen a lot of videos, and that was enough for me to be like, I know who that is. And it was really fun to pick out those different moments. And it, again, just like the other book, is snapshots of different characters when they were on the Star Cruiser. And I just think that is so fun that this is something that they thought to do, and it makes the world feel so much more lived in.
I'm so curious if you know, and you may not have the answer to this, but like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? No, the comic or the actual, like, was the comic released before the Halcyon opened at Disney World?
So it was promotional material is what I'm relatively certain. And the same thing goes for the books. This applies to the books and the comics, where the parks and the Star Cruiser absolutely came first. And then they said, we have a whole publishing line. We should do tie-in material to help drum up excitement. And they actually had the author of, I I think actually it could have been both Delilah S. Dawson and Zoraida Cordova. They actually let them come see like some of the things that they were building in Galaxy's
that's
Edge. So that way they
cool.
had an idea of like what they were writing to, and they got
Yeah.
like, I think in one of the acknowledgments at the end of the book, there was information about like getting to see some of that like artwork and some of the unreleased things that, you know, the public wasn't necessarily seeing, but like
Right.
gave them a way to help build that in their heads and work with Lucasfilm to make sure that the story that they were telling was organic and true to the park that people could visit. And I just think that that is so cool. I love it so
cool.
much.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm not surprised, right? Like if Disney and Lucasfilm, especially, like if they're going to do it, they're going to do it right. But like, it's so cool to hear. So I was curious, like, okay, were the books released first as a like, hey, look, this is what's coming, or was it vice versa, you know? Because it definitely wasn't like an afterthought. You know what I mean? Like it was very clear that it all happened. It was all being developed together despite whatever the release and open date are.
If I'm reading this correctly, the book was released 2 days before the park in Disney World was open. So after Disneyland, but before Disney World. And that is just so interesting to me that they timed it down to like the same week.
Right.
That's just so cool. It came out in August, and the Galaxy's Edge in Hollywood Studios was also opened in August, and they usually have a Star Wars book that will come out in August. And so now I'm wondering whether or not their trend of releasing books in August happened because they were originally timing it with this, and they just stayed on that same publishing schedule. If that's what
started it, or if it just was a happy accident that the park opened at the same time.
They publish more stuff outside of just like August. There's like, I don't know, every quarter, there's like, I don't know, a handful of titles that get released throughout the year. But there is usually an August title. And so now I want to go back and look at publication dates.
I just sent Stevie on a giant rabbit hole. So sorry.
I will add, because I've got a comment about it. There are other mentions of Batuu in other content. I have not mentioned all of them. I've just mentioned like where the books where you spend the most time in Batuu. There is a really great Thrawn trilogy, if you're familiar with Thrawn from the Star Wars cartoons or from the live action Ahsoka show. Grand Admiral Thrawn has 2 different trilogies, and his prequel trilogy in Thrawn Alliances, there's an adventure that happens on Batuu. Actually, no, I'm sorry, that's not the prequel trilogy. That is the Thrawn books are another like confusing one because they released a prequel trilogy after the first set of books was released.
Star Wars, listen. It's too much. I can't keep it straight.
Jackie. I'm
gonna need you to stop doing this.
In the original trilogy.
Okay.
Thrawn Alliances is the title, regardless, by Timothy Zahn. Timothy Zahn is also the writer of the Legends trilogy that I recommended earlier in the episode. He is an excellent, excellent Star Wars writer.
Well, and I think it's so hard. We cannot possibly make an entirely comprehensive list of everything that references Batuu, or everything that references Chewie or Leia or Vi Maradia. Hers is a little bit shorter, but still, it's just impossible to. So this is our best attempt at a starting point, like we talked about, like where to start. That's what we're covering here. So it is not a comprehensive list. Again, Wikipedia will give you a more comprehensive list if there's something specific that you want more on. Again, you can use that, or you can reach out to us.
Absolutely. Because for the most part, every Star Wars character that has a considerable amount of speaking lines either has their own book or is a supporting character in a book or comic somewhere. Like you can absolutely find content about them, unless it's, you know, the one-off droid that's in the background of a scene, or you know, it's another senator that like maybe has like one line. Like there are characters that don't have content, but most characters do have content, and so that's my general blanket statement in terms of trying to find something to read. But we've talked a lot about finding recommendations for yourself if you want to get started reading Star Wars. But if you are trying to help somebody else get into Star Wars, someone besides yourself, your kids, especially your other youths in your life, I have a few recommendations by age range to kind of close out this recommendation list. I say youths because, like, if you're 17, you probably don't want to be called a kid, even though, you know, generally speaking, you are a kid, and that's something to embrace.
Yes, for sure.
I'm going to start on the young end, and I'm going to start with picture books. I love reading picture books via Libby on my phone, on my app, especially like if I'm just like settling down in the evening and I want something like very low stakes to kind of flip through. I love Star Wars like picture books for that. There's a book called Jedi Brave in Every Way by Rosemary and Charles Soule, and Charles Soule is the one that wrote that very first High Republic book. He wrote this book with his daughter, and it follows Yoda, some younglings, and a Wookiee Padawan, and it is so precious. It is so sweet. It delves into like the different struggles that Padawans are having during their Jedi training. It is very precious, and the art is beautiful. And in the same vein of beautiful art, I cannot not mention my favorite Star Wars picture book. It's called The Galaxy Needs You by Caitlin Kennedy. It has a lot of Rey and BB-8 art and like art from the sequel trilogy. The description for the book is, have you ever stopped to think about how there's nobody else in the galaxy who is exactly like you? And this book makes me cry every time I read it. I have chills talking about it. I just really love the art style in this book. And there's just, I don't know, if you're having a bad day, even as an adult, this book will pick you up, especially if you are a Rey fan. Because I was reading on ebook, I took a screenshot of one of the pages and used it as my background. And it's lovely. I highly recommend. If you are looking for middle grade books, and when I say middle grade books, the way that Star Wars and some of the publishing industry kind of refers to middle grade is books that are geared towards kids between the ages of 8 and 12. And obviously, the way that kids are capable of reading versus what they're ready to read is something that I will get into in a minute. Yes. But Star Wars books that are classified as middle grade, my first recommendation is Before the Awakening by Greg Rucka. And this follows Finn, Rey, and Poe before the events of Star Wars Awakens. And I think that this one in particular is a lot of fun. Any of the sequels, middle grade books, is great because the sequels are so heavily featured in Galaxy's Edge and in the parks. And so if you want to help your kids get to know those characters, especially Rey, because she's so prominently featured in the pre-show for Rise, I think that this is a great book for that because you're getting to know them right before The Force Awakens. And another Rey book that I love is called Spark of the Resistance by Justina Ireland. And this follows Rey before the events of Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. And if you couldn't tell, I love Rey. And I think that she's great. And this book was a lot of fun. And my last middle grade recommendation, there are lots of middle grade books out there, so I'm really only picking 3. But my third recommendation is called The Mighty Chewbacca and the Forest of Fear by Tom Engelberger. Tom Engelberger also writes the middle grade Origami Yoda series, which is also a lot of fun if you're familiar with those books.
I've heard of that one before.
Right? Those books are books about kids in middle school that love Star Wars. So they're like Star Wars adjacent books. They're not necessarily like Canon books. They're a lot of fun. I read them because I wanted to know about this Origami Yoda on the cover of this book. And I think that Tom Engelberger is such a funny, clever writer and does such a good job of writing for that age range. He reminds me a lot of Rick Riordan, who wrote the Percy Jackson series, just like really understands where kids are at that age. And it's just about Star Wars. And who doesn't also love a book about Chewie? This book was a lot of fun. And it also includes a character from Rogue One. So if you're reading any of these with your kids, I think this one is especially entertaining because there's definitely like Easter eggs in there for the adults that might be familiar with other types of Star Wars content. And any book that follows a Wookiee, I mean, if you think about how Wookiees talk, all of that is transcribed on the page and makes it a very amazing fun read.
I love the title of that one alone, The Mighty Chewbacca and the Forest of Fear. Like, Because like we see so much of Chewbacca's personality in the movies that like to then call him the mighty Chewbacca is like a little bit comical to me. Like
Yes.
because he is, but he's also not.
He is.
I don't get me wrong, I love Chewie. I love
Yes.
Chewie. Although one time I was in Galaxy's Edge and I had a little plushy bird on attached to my bag and he tried to eat it. So I have a little bit of a beef with Chewie, but I still love him. It's okay.
Yes, yes. I do want to add, there's a comment that I got in the live chat that asks, are these random authors or just like approved by someone? The authors that write for Star Wars are all approved by Lucasfilm. To my knowledge, from my understanding that I've read in acknowledgments for different Star Wars books, is that Lucasfilm will approach different authors and say, hey, we have this idea for a book. Will you write it for us?
Interesting.
And they will get an outline or like a bare idea, or they're invited to make a pitch and say, we want to do a book about this character in this timeline. Give us your ideas. And they'll come back and give them different ideas for a story. So there's lots of different ways that Star Wars books can happen and can exist. And I think that's part of why I love reading the acknowledgments so much. And I so appreciate Star Wars authors that are willing to share that and kind of take a peek behind the curtain. There are also short story compilations that Lucasfilm has released. And so those books are called From a Certain Point of View. And they are basically a book that takes one of the original trilogy movies, so like it takes A New Hope and picks out one of the background characters in a scene, and then an author writes a short story from that character's perspective.
That's fun.
And so the From a Certain Point of View books are a compilation of a bunch of those characters from one of those movies. And so a lot of the authors that have written full-length Star Wars books are ones that maybe got their start in one of those short story compilations. And I think those are really fun in particular because they add so much flavor to the movie when you go back and rewatch it. Mm-hmm. So if you think about The Empire Strikes Back and they're on Hoth, which is that ice planet, and everybody's really cold and bundle up, and they're walking through ice caves. In the very beginning of that movie, Han and Leia are fighting, and basically Leia is acting like she's not in love with Han and is just like, you're just really important to the rebellion. That's why I want you here, not because I have feelings for you. There are characters walking around when they're fighting because that's what makes the world feel lived in.
Yeah.
Well, in the From a Certain Point of View books, you learn that all of those background characters have like bets on when the two of them are going to finally get together.
I love that.
So,
that's amazing.
Right? And it makes sense because like when you're watching that movie, it's like all of these people can hear your conversation.
Right.
And so the fact that Lucasfilm was just like, okay, well, what are they thinking when they're watching this play out in front of them? It is so much fun. And it just reading that and then going back and watching it. And they also are excellent audiobooks. They have some celebrity narrators for some of those short stories, which are just so much fun. And I highly recommend those as well. They're a different kind of book, and so I had not originally included them on my recommendation list. But if you're looking for like bite-sized stories, those are also a lot of fun.
Those seem a little bit like fan service to an extent, right? Like, yes, they're fun. Like, you know, it's fun to give that more detail, but like that's a little bit more fan service of, because like those are the questions that the fans want to know, right?
Yes. And I think that there are questions that a lot of the authors want to know too.
Yeah.
And they had some like bigger names that aren't known for writing books, write stuff as well. If you're familiar with, he's been in a lot of things, but I think he's most popular for Star Trek, The Next Generation, and The Big Bang Theory. If you're familiar with Will Wheaton, he wrote a story in A New Hope. And I am still mad at him about it because it broke my heart.
Oh no!
It's in the collection for A New Hope, and it is a very good story. But it did rip my heart out and shred it to pieces, and I'm still mad at him for it. He did a very good job. I love it a lot. But it's one of the things that I love about Star Wars. Sometimes you're laughing and sometimes you're laughing so hard you're crying, and sometimes you're just crying, and that's the joy of the random.
And all are acceptable responses.
Yes, absolutely. But back to our age recommendations.
So let's get back to where we were. We
took
a sidetrack there for a minute. That's okay. We're back. Okay.
Well, circle back. If you're looking for young adult recommendations or YA recommendations, those are books geared towards kids aged 12 to 18. I really like another Claudia Gray book called Leia, Princess of Alderaan. And this book follows Leia when she's 16 and she's a junior senator. I love Bail Organa, her adopted father, and he is in this book. I love her parents. And if you loved the live action Obi-Wan Kenobi series and you loved getting to see little Leia, this is like an extension of that. If you are thinking about her in that show and you give it another like 7 or 8 years, this book, oh man, Claudia Gray is just so good at writing Leia. And I think I've, over the course of this episode, thrown in every single like Leia POV book that I can because I love it so much. But another great YA book is Rebel Rising by Beth Revis. This follows Jyn Erso as she grows up, and Jyn Erso is one of the main characters in Rogue One, which is the movie that happens right before A New Hope. And it follows her from when she's a kid to when she's a teenager, right before the events of Rogue One take place. And that one is also excellent. Beth Revis also wrote one of the other books that I recommended earlier in this episode, The Princess and the Scoundrel, the one that follows Leia and Han on their honeymoon. And then I wanted to throw in a High Republic YA book, Into the Dark, which is also by Claudia Gray. You'll notice that I have a little bit of a bias towards her as an author. This is one of the early books in phase 1 of the High Republic. It was maybe the second one published not long after Light of the Jedi. And it has all new characters, but you can definitely jump in without really knowing much else about the era. It happens concurrently in universe with Light of the Jedi. And it's a lot of fun. I love the new characters that you get to meet. They still feel familiar, even though they're new. And I think that it's a really excellent starting place for young adult readers into Star Wars.
Nice.
And I do want to add, now that I've kind of closed out my recommendations, that for all of these books at any age, you know your kid best or whoever you're recommending to best and what they may be able to handle. So especially starting with the middle grade age range and up, I need you to keep in mind that the second word in this franchise is wars. So Star Wars inherently deals with some pretty serious topics. And so while it is fun and campy and entertaining, those stories still include everything that comes along with a galaxy that's at war. It's very much the crying section of what I had mentioned earlier when I was talking about laughing or crying or laughing while you're crying. Like, serious stuff happens too, and Star Wars does a great job of balancing all of those things. But I would be remiss to not say that, like, not every kid is ready for some of those topics. I think that they're a great way to have a lot of those conversations. They're something that has helped me kind of shape the way that I kind of see the world, and, you know, choosing to do something. That's what all of these characters are doing, is that they're making a choice, you know, amidst the situation that they're given. And a lot of times that happens on a really small scale level too. Like, you're watching Padawans grow up and figuring out how to tackle their fear. And there's so many of those life lessons that are applicable to kids of all ages, but it is important to keep in mind what the broader universe looks like that those stories are happening in.
Yeah, and I would suggest as a parent, like, you gotta screen it, right? Like, if you're not sure and you have not read it, like, I always highly suggest, especially with stuff like Star Wars, Marvel, some of those bigger franchises, like, there is, like you said, inherently just a lot of fighting, violence, you know, those types of things. It happens. So you really need to screen it and read it yourself first, or talk to someone who has read it that knows your kid. You know, there's lots of different ways that you can introduce them without it being either over their head to the point where they don't enjoy it, or just too much for them to read. I have an 8-year-old who reads above his grade level quite a bit above his grade level, but like he is not ready for a lot of these Star Wars stories because he doesn't have the mental capacity to handle some of what I know happens in these.
And that's the exact same kind of reader I was as a kid. I was very ready to read way above my age range, but I wasn't necessarily ready for that.
Yes.
And I do want to add that, like, I enjoyed all of these categories meant for younger kids as an adult. So if you're ever worried, like Jackie was saying, about whether or not your kid is ready for that book, reading it with them can be a really, really fun way to bond, especially with the audiobooks too, because then you're already in a great position to have those conversations if questions come up. A lot of the audiobooks, like some of the audiobooks are narrated by the characters they voice in the Star Wars cartoons. If you're familiar with Hondo Ohnaka, who is in Smuggler's Run in Galaxy's Edge, he has a young reader's book and he narrates that audiobook. And so you're getting
fun.
this book about Hondo in
Love
Hondo's
that.
voice. And so like I said, there's so many books that I could recommend. There's so many things to add and throw out. And there's just like a huge universe of things to explore. And I know that sounds on the nose being the Star Wars universe, but I really do mean it honestly and genuinely. And I think that it's a really fun way to bond. And I remember doing that with my dad and reading books with him, and that was just like a fun thing to do together. We read the Redwall series that way, and I think that Star Wars really sets itself up for that because there's so much to get out of it as an adult reading it with them that you can get out of it for you, not just what you're getting out of it for them.
Right. And I will say that all of the recommendations that Stevie has listed here will be included in our show notes. So if you are listening to us anywhere that you can see that description and caption, we will make sure that is linked for you to find there. You'll also be able to find it in our Discord channel. Our good friend Kirk at Walrus Carp has a Discord that Mom Street has a channel for. We will put this in we have a chat channel, and then we also have like a channel where just some of our resources live. I'm going to put it there. Excuse me, so that way you guys can find it and it won't get lost in the chat. So it will be there for you guys to have access to as well. And like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, that Stevie has a very extensive list also. We're going to give you the short list to start, which are the titles that she mentioned in this episode. And then we'll go from there and elaborate as needed and as people kind of reach out and request for.
I will add that my much longer list breaks every book down by the year that they happen within the Star Wars universe. And I wanted to add that because when you look at it, it might be a little overwhelming, but I'm happy to answer questions. It's weird to think about that there is a way that they date in universe in Star Wars that's different than our own, which is cool. And it makes the universe feel more lived in. It makes it feel more real. But that is the way that I have things categorized. It is a lot. And if you don't know what you're looking at, it's kind of hard to read. And so I wanted to put that little disclaimer in here that when that goes up, feel free to ask questions. I am happy to help.
Well, and that gives such interesting context to know, like, obviously they think of years and dates differently than we do, right? Like, obviously. Yeah. So it gives a little bit more context, like we were talking about even earlier with the original Star Wars comic books. Like, where do they fit in with the original trilogy? Well, that can give you a resource like that can give you some context on how things are happening sequentially.
Yes. And I happened to read things chronologically. That was what I decided to do, and like document my way through the universe and read through everything. At the time I started at the beginning of the prequels and the books in that era, and I went through, you don't have to go that way. I just decided to be a completionist because I just wanted to see how the universe built on itself. But it is a lot. Like, as I said at the top of the show, I've read over 176 Star Wars titles. Like, that is a lot to commit to. I don't recommend it for most people. If you are just like, I'm going to dive in, I want to read everything. Yeah, it is a lot of fun because I also watched the Star Wars cartoons at the same time, and I interlaced that with watching Star Wars Rebels and the Clone Wars and the Bad Batch. And those shows are so fun. I could wax poetic about all of those shows, and maybe we'll do a whole other episode on those characters and their mentions in the parks. But you definitely don't need to do that. And so when I post that list, that's just, think of that as like an archive, like an encyclopedia to refer to, and not as a recommended reading order per se. Just think of it as a way to couch content in the timeline and what happens where and when, and then what happens before and after the book.
Yeah. Well, and using it as a reference point, right? So if you've picked
Yes.
something out of a specific, era that we talked about way back at the beginning of this episode that matches with the movies, like if you want to know specifically exactly when that story takes place, well, that's something that you can use to help you with that.
Yes, definitely. And I do want to say, as we kind of close this out, that I am very lucky that I have, growing up my whole life, had really wonderful libraries to take advantage of, that I could find a lot of these titles in either physical or ebook form. And when they haven't had a title, I've actually submitted what libraries refer to as a purchase suggestion. And it's basically a way to ask your library to buy a book. So if you're going and looking for a book and it's just like not in the budget, because I totally get it. If books can be expensive, if it's not in the budget, you can ask and see if they will buy that book for you and add it to their collection. As far as I know, that's something that all libraries do. And you can also do that with ebooks. On the app that I mentioned, Libby, you can do the same kind of thing. There's like a little alert button and it sends a notification to your library, and it also catalogs it within your account. So if your library adds that title, you will get a ping that says, hey, your library added this title. Do you want to check it out? And I think that that is such a lovely, fun feature to kind of find all of this stuff, because it is a lot. Like, I've read the vast majority of this via my library. I don't think I could have done this without my library.
Yeah,
they're the unsung hero of all book readers.
Right? Yeah, that's a lot of money to pour into Star Wars books, which is obviously worth it. And if you can support those authors and purchase those books and you want to, by all means, but totally valid and understandable that it may not be within your budget to go out and buy 20 Star Wars books that you want to read.
I will
on the low end.
That if you like thrifting, they're a lot of fun to kind of like flip your way through bargain bins at thrift stores or a half price books. That's another really great way to kind of look for some of these things too. And if you are asking your library to buy a Star Wars book, that author is still getting the credit because the library bought it. It just wasn't you. So you're definitely still supporting the author by going through your library.
Yes, so true. Okay, did we get through all your notes?
Yes.
That was a lot.
Yes.
We made it.
But what's so funny to me is that this is absolutely the short, long version. You know what I mean? The short answer is you can start anywhere. Go read. You know what I mean? But nobody wants it. That's not a fun answer.
No.
But this is the long answer, because I don't like saying pick your favorite character in era without giving people recommendations and here's an actual place that you can start, because and sometimes it's hard to pick a character. I will say that my favorite character doesn't really have her own book. I love Maz Kanata, but she doesn't really show up in the same way. But yeah, there's just a lot out there, and it can be hard to figure out what to do.
For sure. I mean, my head is spinning just and I've read through your notes before we even read them on here. I'm just so many books. It's great though. It's lovely and it's wonderful. And we've gotten lots of comments in our live chat here about how they're excited and that everyone's little book hearts are happy listening to all of your recommendations. So it's wonderful. And again, these will all be available for you guys in the caption of our episode here and also on our Discord channel. And as always, you guys can reach out to us if you've got further questions. You can reach out to our Mom Street channel if that's easiest for you. You're also welcome to reach out to Stevie on her TikTok and Instagram. She is at Starship Stevie, all one word, so you can find her there.
I want to talk about books, and that's why I post videos on the internet, because I want to share that with other people, because reading is a solitary experience. When you're reading, it is just you and the page, and if you're excited about something or a book makes you feel something, I want to talk about it, but it's not everybody in my immediate physical circumstances have read the thing that I'm talking about. And the internet is such a good place. Exactly, Jackie.
Right.
And that's fine. I don't need everybody to. And it is, I've made so many good friends from just posting about Star Wars books on TikTok and found other people that have read the books. And it is so much fun. It's not weird to me. I want to put that out there for everybody that's listening. If you find a video of mine from a couple years ago and you leave a comment, I don't think that's weird. I want you to know that that's not it's not creepy to me. I know that there's a misconception on the internet that if you're going through something, but I put in my caption like the name of books, so that way if somebody searches the name of that book, my video will come up, because like I'm still going to want to talk about the book 2 years after I read it. So don't feel weird if you just pop in, you're like, hey, what was the name of this? Can you help me with this? I am happy, very happy to answer.
Love it. Perfect. Well, I think that, like we said, wraps up our short, long version of how to read Star Wars. Thank you guys all so much for joining us, for listening, for being excited about these books, just like we are. Kind of a look ahead as to what's coming up next for Mom Street. Our next podcast episode is going to be a solo episode of mine. I'm going to be chatting about Disney collections. So stay tuned for that. We're going to be talking about all sorts of different things that you can collect and what are good options for kids if you're someone who's visiting the parks and wants to kind of start that collection for your kiddos. So that is what is to come. In the meantime, you are always welcome to reach out to us with comments, questions, advice, ideas for future episodes. We are at Mom Street USA on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. You can find us those places. You can always find us momstreetusa@gmail.com. And again, on our Discord server, which we've already mentioned in this episode, you can always reach out and comment to us on there. Especially if you're looking for additional information about these book recommendations, that's a great place to go. So that way Stevie and other members of our community can help you with all of that. But Stevie, any last thoughts before we finalize and put a pin on this episode?
Yeah, happy reading.
I love it. That's perfect. Well, thank you guys again so much for being here, and we will catch you next time on Mom Street USA. Bye, everyone.